Welcome to the second video, where we're going to be looking at the events that changed Britain significantly between 43 and 1650 AD. Last lesson we looked at the Roman occupation of Britain and the changes that had on Britain and the British people. If you missed that video, go back and watch it, because we're going to be looking at a different aspect today. I want you just to write down from the things that we learnt this year and the lesson that we did on the previous video, how the following events changed Britain. So I want you to write down how the Roman invasion changed Britain, how the Battle of Hastings changed Britain, and how the Battle of Bosworth changed Britain. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do that, so just press pause on the video and then start the video up again once you've written down your explanation of those 3 points. In this lesson, we're going to look at how the Magna Carta changed Britain. Now, the Magna Carta happened during the Norman time. So we're looking at this section here between 1066 and between 1485, when the Tudors take over. So what was the Magna Carta? It means Great Charter, and it was a list of rights agreed to by King John in 1215. So when was the Magna Carta introduced? So King John was king for about 17 years, between 1199 and 1216, and he was called the worst king of England. His brother Richard the Lionheart was very popular and successful, and John was unpopular, and he had a series of things that made him unsuccessful. He lost Normandy to the French, and he had to charge huge taxes to try to pay for wars to win it back. The barons were angry, and they forced John to sign a charter to protect their rights. He's seen, in many sort of old historical films as being cowardly and greedy, and not the ruler that his brother was. So we're going to have a little look at why the barons were so angry with John. Okay, King John was driven out of France by King Philip. He needed money to pay for an army to win back that land. Okay, so because he needs army, he needs to get that money through taxes. Those taxes affected everyone, but the barons paid the most. So the barons are being paid to try and win back something that they think is John's fault for losing, and that makes them incredibly angry. Not only did they have to pay, a lot of them actually had to serve in that army, so they had to go and join the army to fight his war. Anyone who annoyed him was put in prison or made to pay heavy fines, which would take their power away from them. If they couldn't afford to pay for their own men, then they wouldn't have the power that they'd once had. And despite that, some of these barons, their land was actually in the parts of France that John had lost. So they were angry because they no longer had that land. And there's also another reason. They thought that John had murdered his nephew Arthur, because the person who should have been king once Richard died, or was no longer king, would have been Arthur, but he dies before he gets a chance. And there are people who believe that it was John who had orchestrated that to enable himself to become the king, which obviously angered the barons, because they didn't want anyone cheating their way to the throne. So this is the Magna Carta, and this is a simplified version of a very, very big and complex document, but essentially it said 6 important points. John had to rule according to the law, and that's a big point, because before then, essentially, the kings were the law, and they could do a lot of what they wanted to do themselves. So they make some laws here that can't prevent the king from just doing anything they want. And one of the things is they weren't allowed to imprison barons without a trial, and obviously that had happened before, so if you just accuse someone of doing something wrong just because you don't like them or they disagree with you, put them in prison, and then you don't need to worry about them anymore. And from this point on, that wouldn't be allowed to happen. There's also whole trials in court where other people could see and people could witness it, rather than just in secret by saying, oh no, he agreed, he admitted to being guilty in secret, and so that's why he's put in prison. To have fair taxes for the barons, to let freemen travel where they like. So these are people who aren't the peasants, who aren't the serfs, who can travel in between the different parts of the country, because at times they were restricted to say, no, you have to stay here because it benefits me if you stay here. The church was incredibly powerful, and in certain times the monarchy would try to influence what the church was doing, and then they weren't to seize crops without paying. Sometimes they're like, oh, my army needs to be fed, so I'm just going to take all of your crops, which would cause devastation to small communities if the money that they were reliant upon was not going to come through that year because the king had decided he was just going to take the crops without paying for them. So those things were put in place, and they all seem fairly obvious to us, but this was a huge and massive change for the time. So I want you to copy out this table. I want you to think who do the effects of who does the Magna Carta actually help. So I want you to copy out this table, and I want you to obviously think to this first one: the king must not interfere with the church. Who is that going to benefit? Is it going to benefit the church? Is it going to benefit the barons? Is it going to benefit the knights? Or is it going to benefit the peasants? And have a good think about which ones it's going to affect the most. So pause this video, copy out that table, and then fill it in and have a good think about how each one of these laws, each one of these aspects of the Magna Carta would have helped that different group of people. Okay, we're now going to have a little look at how would we use this information that we've picked up to answer an exam question, and an explain question on the Magna Carta might look something like this: explain how the Magna Carta changed Britain. So we need to think about some of the changes it made. It forced the king to listen to the people. It gave the people some more rights. It also showed that the king could now be challenged, that the king was not all powerful, and it showed that the people had the power to bring about change if they needed to. So an answer to this, this might be a 4-mark question, and on the next slide I'm going to break down for you what an example model answer would look like. So first thing we need to do, if we look at this, explain how the power of the leader was different in the Roman period and the 13th century, and we'd get 4 marks for that. So we start by identifying what the difference was. So one way that the power was different in the Roman period and in the 13th century was how much they had to listen to the people. So we're saying that in the 13th century, after the Magna Carta, they have to listen to the people, but in the Roman period they didn't. An example from the Roman period was when Paulinus killed all the rebels in the Boudica revolt. So we're getting a mark for that example. So we've got 2 marks for identifying that's why it was, and then we're having to bring 2 parts of our own knowledge in. An example from the 13th century, as in 1215, when King John was forced to listen to the people and introduce the Magna Carta. There we go, we get our 4th and final mark for our example. So we're getting 2 marks for identifying what the difference was, and then we're getting a mark for an example that proves our points on each section. Now we're going to have a go at doing this ourselves. Explain how the power of the leader was different in the 11th century and the 13th century. So 11th century, we're thinking 1066. 13th century, we're thinking maybe 1215. So we need to say, how was the power of the leader different in the 11th century and the 13th century? I'd like you to pause this video now and have a go at answering this question using these sentence starters to help you formulate a model answer. Okay, so if we have a look at a model answer to explain this, one way that the power of the leader was different in the 11th century and the 13th century was how much they had to listen to the people. We've used a similar example as we did with the Romans. Now that's okay. If the example is still valid, it doesn't matter that the time period's changed. But of course what we'd have to do is we'd have to change our examples, because we can't talk about William the Conqueror attacking the Boudica rebels, because that happened 1,000 years before he was around. So an example from the 11th century was William killed everyone who did not submit to him in the harrying of the north. There we go, there's another bit of historical information that we're bringing in, and that's given us some more marks towards our question. An example from the 13th century, as in 1215, is when King John was forced to listen to the people and introduce the Magna Carta, and we get a mark for that. So we can use the same example, and quite often that will be the way in history. If you really fully understand some of the sections, then you can use that information for evidence in a number of different ways if you're creative with your answer. So what we want to take away from this lesson is obviously that the Magna Carta made changes. Obviously it changed some laws, but it really changed the landscape for power in Britain, because up to this point you can see through the Roman period, you can see through 1066 and the rule of William the Conqueror, that people didn't really question the king and get away with it. Some people tried to, but you normally found that they had quite a brutal end. Whereas from this point forward, they can question, the people with enough power could question the king and start to shape the way that the country was actually governed. So that's everything for this lesson. Please, if you haven't gone back and answered the questions, I really urge you to do that, because it is very good practice to ensure that you are very good at answering these explain questions, because they do come up on most of the exam papers that you will do. Until the next video, thank you very much and goodbye.